there is an interesting growing conflation between entities that identify themselves with what are known as Hebrews and those individuals who have been identified as Indian. Now, I clarify this because Indian is not a name that the indigenous or original people would have been calling themselves. That's an English word, and so therefore they were not speaking English, so therefore they were not calling themselves Indians. And so there are a lot of dynamics like that. And we're going to talk about a few of these conflations and these superimpositions. But what's really interesting is this conflation between the Hebrew identity and the Indian identity. It seems pretty clear that part of the superimposition is genetic. And so there were these clusters of males that came over as colonizers, and they participated in a genetic annihilation of the males, of a certain percentage of the males. And so therefore, a large cluster of males in the Americas have these DNA signatures that point to the east. They point to Western Asia, they point to Africa, Western Africa, and they point to Europe, specifically Western Europe. And so you see those E1Bs and those R1Bs, and those are very distinct in terms of the distance. They are actually pretty far apart from each other in terms of the genetic mutations that get from E all the way down to R. But there was some confederacy apparently going on in order to facilitate this entire process. But what's fascinating about all of this is this increasing push to identify individuals who are likely indigenous, to identify them as Hebrew. And so putting that identity onto them. See, the problem with this is that Hebrew identity is a colonizer identity, whether we are talking about the Moriscos or the Marranos or those who converted and then started calling themselves Catholics, or the individuals who came over from Scotland, came over from Ireland, Cornwall, Wales, Spain, France, Italy, Germany. We could go on and on with this. These individuals, their DNA is superimposed onto this particular geopolitical space. And so therefore, there's a lot of confusion about who is who and what is what and who was here first. But what we see are some interesting things as research is popping up more and more. We see some very interesting things about the first DNA signatures that might have been in the Americas, and perhaps some sort of migration that was going out of America to other places in terms of these mutations, because some of the mutations are coming after some of the DNA signatures that have been increasingly noted in the Americas. And so that A, Y haplogroup, and then interestingly, this C, Y haplogroup, which places both of these collectives earlier in terms of DNA signatures, earlier in time, in contrast to the E that is very popular and the R1B that is also very popular. These are younger sorts of signatures or mutations coming after the A and the C. And so that's interesting in and of itself. But what's also interesting is how you have these Q's and R's that are coming after the I and the J. And so the R is all the way at the bottom. It's sort of the last stop, on the train route. So you've got that R down there, but it's a heavy population in terms of the Americas. And so you see lots and lots of this R that has been transplanted. But what we're going to look at right now is this very odd dynamic with respect to the entities understanding themselves as the Hebrew Israelites who have created these 12 tribe charts. What's interesting about these 12 tribe charts is that you can see the usurpation of the indigenous people in the 12 tribes chart. And so typically there is the belief that those who would now identify as the American Indians and those who would typically identify as these Hebrew Israelites, there is a narrative that suggests that those who identify as Hebrew Israelites, we're going to say Black Hebrew Israelites because there's something specific going on here with that whole dynamic. And so the Black Hebrew Israelites, there is a belief or an assertion that their history is limited to a slavery history. And so the way they made their way into the Americas is based upon being enslaved, and this is part of a prophecy. This is a part of a curse coming out of the book of Deuteronomy, but there's something else going on, and you can see the manifestation of it in those 12 tribes charts. What you see is the entities understood as the Hebrews putting onto the indigenous people a subordinate positioning. And you see it in this chart. At first, it may not jump out at you, but then when you start to analyze the chart and try to figure out what's the rhyme and the reason to the chart, there's an interesting dynamic where you have certain collectives of people that are on top. It's not alphabetical. It's not going in terms of chronological order. Something else is going on there where you have collectives that are identifying as coming out of Africa on the top. And then the entities that appear to be coming out of Spain very directly, they are in the middle. And then the indigenous people are on the bottom. What's interesting about this also is that the person who's on the top in terms of those 12 sons, that top son is not really the top son. That son is really a middle son. And then the top son is down at the bottom, towards the bottom, embedded in the American indigenous collectives. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, but it's also interesting to see how this usurpation has taken place with those Moriscos and Marranos, and oftentimes the ones who were darker, the darker Moriscos and Marranos, taking on this Black Hebrew Israelite identity and positioning themselves in terms of this chart in the superior or the primary position. And remember, there is a history in terms of those who are identifying as Hebrew. A part of the narrative is this constant supplanting and usurpation and taking something that belongs to someone else and converting it to self. And so you see that going on and on and on. And this is no exception. The difference, however, is that the individuals who have created this new sort of pathway here, those individuals have historically been positioned as being seen as oppressed. However, what you see here is these entities being the oppressor, these entities actually flipping the script in terms of who comes first and who comes second in terms of this birth order dynamic. Now, of course, what's also odd about this is that you have the individuals who are identifying as Hebrew Israelite having a high prevalence of that E and that R dynamic, the E1B and the R1B. And these are definitely coming from the East. And now we are seeing increasingly among those who are identified as American Indian indigenous to this gigantic land space, we are seeing more C's pop up. And so C is coming right after that A, which suggests that the E and the R again are coming after. And so it's just very interesting that in terms of genetics, you see the flip of what's going on with these 12 tribe charts. And you also see a collective of individuals who should really be the middle children positioning themselves as the firstborns. And of course, using a variety of biblical narratives to undergird this. But one thing that I encourage you to do is to read the biblical narratives as close to the original language as possible, and you may not see exactly what it is that people are purporting in terms of the explanation for why there is this flipping of the script and turning the inheritance upside down in terms of which child is first and which child is second. Before we go into that, we're just going to quickly look at a few constructs also that have been brought over from the East, and individuals in the Americas have adopted these terms. They, again, are not their terms, but they've adopted these terms and these constructs as their own because they were superimposed. The collectives that colonized were by and large patrilineal and patriarchal. And so what you see with these three constructs that we're just going to touch on, we see the pushing of this whole construct, which seems like a natural construct, really. But these terms and these constructs have been put onto the indigenous people by the collectives that served as the settlers and the colonizers. And again, it doesn't matter the skin color. That's a game that's played. You oftentimes would have people in the same family looking very different, some very, very light and some very, very dark, but they are the same people. And so here are these three constructs. One is the construct of the tribe. Tribe is not an indigenous term. Now, some people might offer that, of course, they were organized according to tribes or according to families. But we don't really know that because we've been dealing with this construct of tribe. And this construct of tribe, in terms of etymology, it is not an indigenous word. Clan is not an indigenous word, and chief is not an indigenous word. In fact, you can find all of these in scripture related to the 12 tribes. You also see these words as being deeply embedded in Scots culture, Irish culture, and the rest of Western Europe. So Spain, Portugal, England, all of those are related to these different constructs. And again, you see these constructs in Hebrew tradition in the scripture. And the individuals that came over again were of these Hebrew persuasions. And so when they started families, when they sort of renegotiated these cultures, these are identities that they gave to people. So they might see a collective and decide to identify that collective as a tribe, identify that collective as a clan, identify what they thought was the leader as the chief, or if there was no chief, make themselves the chief. Because that is a dynamic that they brought over. That's a part of the whole expulsion dynamic also from there. Because in Scotland, it was the clan chiefs that sold the people out. Okay, and so in some instances, you have these clan chiefs that came over and continued on with this role. And that's also how they got all of the land out of people too, taking on this identity and claiming they were the clan chief over here too, and then engaging in this same removal dynamic. And so what happened here was just an instant replay of what already took place in Scotland, what took place in Ireland. And so instead of those people standing their ground and holding their own in their own land, they allowed themselves, yes, I said allowed themselves, they allowed themselves to be moved to another land to do to other people what had essentially been done to them. Now, check out this prophecy that is being given in Genesis 49. This is supposed to be coming from Jacob, and he's laying down what's going to happen to these 12 sons at the end times. Now, this is what it's saying in English. I have not done an exegesis of this to make sure that this is exactly what is being said, because there's all sorts of stuff going on when you do an exegesis of this particular book and chapter. And so there are many things that we believe are in there that are not in there, specifically related to the Judah and the scepter. But right now, at number 3, we see this prophecy about Reuben. Now, Reuben is the firstborn, but somehow, according to this narrative, Reuben gets sort of kicked off of his throne, and he is subordinated to the entity known as Judah. So it indicates here, and this is supposed to be Jacob talking. It's not always clear because sometimes Jacob is referring to himself apparently as Jacob, and then sometimes referring to himself as Israel. Not very clear, very confusing. So anyway, he indicates, Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. And so Reuben is all that. However, he flips it in the next verse, and he tells him, you will not excel. And the reason for him not excelling and losing his position is because, according to this narrative, he defiled his father's bed. There's a lot of defiling of fathers and fathers' beds and all of that sort of stuff going on in Scripture. And so this is another indication of this whole defiling thing with Reuben. And in this particular case, this becomes the excuse for usurping the position of the firstborn. Again, there is usurpation after usurpation after usurpation of the firstborn in Scripture, and this is no exception. Oddly, Judah comes from way behind and is positioned as number 1. It's important to keep in mind also that not only is the narrative coming from the Hebrew perspective, we'll start there, the Shem perspective, it's also coming from the Abraham perspective, and specifically from the Isaac perspective, the Jacob perspective, and then very specifically the Judah perspective. And so you see Judah taking on this God-like quality with respect to the other brothers. It's very odd because at first it looks like Joseph has this elevated position, but the person who had Joseph enslaved actually becomes the one who has the ultimate elevated position according to the narrative, and that would be Judah. All the way up to Judah being given this name that indicates worship and praise, and his brothers are going to bow down to him, and all of that. Okay, so there's a lot going on here with Judah where he almost takes on the identity of Joseph. Okay, so this interesting dynamic with Reuben being switched with Judah is manifested in the 12 tribes charts, and we're going to look at how this takes place. And so here you see this 12 tribes chart. There are variations, but they don't vary that much. And so this is a standard chart that has these brothers listed. And interestingly, there are 2 names missing. And then with the one son, he's replaced by his 2 sons. And so they are sort of stand-ins for him. And so that makes sense. But then there's one that's missing, and that would be Dan. And there's an interesting prophecy about Dan in this same book chapter. And Dan is identified in a particular way. And then you see Dan sort of appearing and disappearing in terms of his presentation in Scripture. And you also see Jacob, making this very odd comment related to or right after he gives the prophecy about Dan. And the question is, who exactly is Jacob talking about? Because after talking about Dan, he sort of makes this reference to his Lord. And so it's a little confusing, a piece in there, and you don't see anything like it when he's discussing these other sons. But let's just look at this order here. So you have Judah, Benjamin, Levi, Ephraim, Manasseh, Simeon, Zebulun, Gad, Reuben, Asher, Issachar, and Naphtali. Okay. Clearly, they are not in alphabetical order. And so the question is, what kind of order are they in? First, they are in part, an order that puts the kingdom of Judah over what would be considered the kingdom of Israel. And so you see that Judah, Benjamin, Levi, we've talked about that before. They are on the top, okay? And when you reflect on the west coast of Africa, that slave coast area, you see manifestations of these particular collectives according to the 12 tribes chart. And so you see manifestations of Judah. You see what has been identified as the tribe of Levi with the Benin Dahomey dynamic. And then you see these manifestations of Benjamin, which tend to be associated with Jamaica, so the West Indies. And so right after that, you see additional names, and it's not completely clear why they are in the order they are in. But we're going to see some correlations, and we're going to pull them apart so that you can see the correlation. And so here you can see what's on top very clearly. Now, what's on top? Now, this is odd because we are talking about the Americas. And so what's interesting is that out of these 12 tribes, the ones that are on the top are the visitors. Okay. So the ones that are visiting are the ones that are on top. And these ones that are on top, Judah, Benjamin, Levi, they are specifically associated with West Africa. Okay. And they are also associated with Europe. And so there is this relationship between that west coast of Africa and Europe. So much so, it's very difficult to disentangle them. But that E1B dynamic suggests ones that may be more closely related to West Africa, whereas you also have some Judah and Benjamin, not so much Levi, interestingly. You have these manifestations of the R1B with Judah and Benjamin, and it's a significant amount, quite frankly. And so you see this Western European, Western African dynamic going on here with individuals who were likely a part of the Morisco Marano Confederacy that made them their way over into the Americas. And so that's what we have on top. And so here you see what's called American blacks taking the place of Reuben. So they are you're going to see the American Indians in a minute. And so with this, Judah, what's considered the American blacks, have been positioned as usurping the position of Reuben. And Reuben is that oldest one who has now been identified as one of the American Indian groups. So it's very interesting. And then right under the Judah, Benjamin, Levi collection, which of course includes, that's the Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall, Wales, and France connection there. And then we have right under them the Spanish connection. Okay, so you have the Puerto Ricans, the Cubans, and the Dominicans. Again, with high percentages of the E and the R that E1B and that R1B. And again, they are pretty far away from each other in terms of the mutations, with R again being at the end of that train, but significant in terms of these collectives. And at the very bottom, again, not in any alphabetical order, you see these collectives who are identified with the indigenous people. And so you see Zebulon has been identified as the Mayans, Guatemala to Panama. And then Gad, which is pronounced God, by the way. Very interesting again. Um, Gad is identified as the American Indians. And then the one who's supposed to be on top, Reuben, is down below, almost at the bottom. And Reuben is identified as the Seminole Indians. Again, all of these collectives that are at the bottom are the indigenous people. And somehow or another, um, Africa and Europe have been positioned on the top in terms of this dispersion. And the narrative goes something like the Africans and the Europeans came over to the Americas and they found their brothers here already. And so they found the American indigenous people here, and then they just incorporated them into this whole Hebrew narrative. Now, remember, all of them are being colonized. All of these indigenous people are being colonized by the ones that you see up at the top, specifically the R1Bs and then also the E1Bs. And then with the American indigenous, there is quite a variety in terms of their Y haplogroups, including many of these colonizer haplogroups, of course. But there's an interesting dynamic with that manifestation of the A, the C, and the Q. Okay, so after Gad and Reuben, then you have the people in Colombia and Uruguay. They've identified them as the Incas. Okay, and that's Asher. And then Issachar has been identified as the Aztecs, the Mexicans. And then Naphtali has been identified as the Argentinian people and the people of Chile. Again, all of these people are the indigenous people. And it's very interesting when people who identify as being an oppressed collective engage in oppressive dynamics. And so that's what you see here with this superimposition of these identities, and also sort of this flipping of the script. You see this with these Moriscos and Moranos that came over claiming to be oppressed, and going through the Inquisition, but they must not have been too oppressed because they had plenty of time and energy to create all of these power bases and utilize all of these resources and usurp everything they could, from the entities that were the indigenous people, including the identities of the indigenous people, taking the men, replacing the men with themselves, and in some instances, sending the men. This has been noted with the slave voyages. There have been ships that have just taken what appear to be indigenous men from one part of America to another part of America. And so maybe they were in the Carolinas and they were shipped to Jamaica or Mobile, Alabama, all sorts of weird stuff in terms of these transportation dynamics. But again, you have these entities that are claiming to be victims, but they have no problem with becoming victimizers with respect to the people that allowed them to visit. In many instances, welcomed them in and helped them. And you see this dynamic with colonization all over the world. You have a collective of people, they are the indigenous people. There are some people who need help. They've been kicked out, they've been abused, wherever they happen to be. And the indigenous people take them in. And once they take them in, that's when they get bitten by the people who claimed to be oppressed, claimed to be enslaved, claimed to be abused, claimed to have been removed. And so you see this pattern over and over and over again. You see it in the Americas. It happened in Europe. It happened in Africa. It's happening in the Middle East. And so it happens. It has happened in all of these different places. But there are usual suspects that are involved in these dynamics that went around doing this sort of thing, sort of, just usurping and upsetting the apple cart for everyone, everywhere that they went. And their descendants, for whatever reason, seem to continue this on. Now, again, some people really are the descendants of individuals who needed assistance. They are the descendants of individuals who really were enslaved. But some of these entities are not descendants of enslaved people. They are descendants of enslavers that are pretending or have been pretending to be enslaved. And again, this is not about skin color. This is about these class issues. And so this is also part of the reason why reparations is not going to go the way people think reparations is going to go. And it occurred to me recently that reparations is not the actual term that should be used, and we should talk about that. But reparations can't go the way people think reparations is going to go, because you have so many people that are manifesting identities right now that are inconsistent with their actual ancestor identities. And that issue would come up in terms of determining who was entitled to reparations. And so there are some real surprising things going on there. So we're going to wrap this up by looking at a little bit of information about these Y haplogroups that are in the Caribbean that are related to that middle group, that Ephraim, Manasseh, Simeon group. What's also interesting about Simeon is there's some indication that Simeon also belongs with the kingdom of Judah versus the kingdom of Israel, but we can talk about that at some other time. Let's move on here. And so what this article does is it explores, and it's pretty recent, so this is coming out last year. What it's doing is exploring the legacy of African and indigenous Caribbean admixture in Puerto Rico specifically. And so they are looking at Y haplogroups that appear to come out of Africa, but some of those Y haplogroups that appear to come out of Africa are perhaps coming out of Europe and are perhaps coming out of Western Asia specifically. And then they are also looking at some of these Y haplogroups that appear to be more related to what would be considered the indigenous people. But again, remembering that, as you go down, you were talking about mutations that came from these original founders with these earlier letters in terms of the alphabet. Now, this was a very small sample, and so who knows what would happen if you had a bigger sample, but they have a very small sample here, and what they are finding is there's a correlation between the people in Puerto Rico specifically and individuals who would be primarily on the west coast of Africa, and then not people, but the men. The men that you currently find on the west coast of Africa, because I want to be clear about that. It's not that they started on the west coast of Africa, but that's where they are right now. And also a correlation between this particular group of men and men who are currently in the Americas, in mainland America, and also the western portion of Europe, and that's that R1b. There is something odd going on with the R1b and the E1b. And if we could probably figure that out, we would have lots of answers to lots of questions, because you have individuals who are identifying as E1b and those who are identifying as R1b, and they are both identifying as these 12 tribes. Okay, so there were some additional haplogroups, again, very interesting, with the G and the J, and also the haplogroup I. Because what this is indicating is that R1b is a part of the mutation dynamic coming after the G and the J. Again, it's way down. It's like a very new sort of collective. And so it's way down at the end with all of these other collectives preceding it in terms of founders and in terms of mutations. And so that R is way down there. It's It's interesting. And then you have also an individual identified with that Q, and that Q is frequently identified as an indigenous Y haplogroup. Now, of course, with all of this, it's all complicated because you have this colonizer dynamic going on. And so it's not completely clear where any of it is coming from, because in some instances it looks like there was a colonization taking place coming from the west, and then a colonization coming from the east, coming down from the north. So there's a lot going on in terms of the DNA signatures and where they are coming from, because there are some interesting implications about some of these DNA signatures with the collectives that appear to have been coming from the north and descending into the south. And so that would be that Siberian area that appears to have been coming down and then moving across. And so finally, what I want to do is encourage you to make sure that when people are asserting things to you that conflate religion and culture with all of these histories, that you check this stuff out for yourself. There is a tendency for people to want to feel important. People want to feel valued, just human beings. And a part of the Hebrew identity specifically is what might even be an overvaluing, because there is that whole dynamic of identifying self as chosen, and everyone else sort of being left over. That identity of being chosen also indicates that idea of being first, that idea of being the primacy, that idea of being foremost, out front, on the top. So there's a lot that goes along with it. And so many people are inclined to want to identify with that, particularly if you're talking about collectives of people who have been oppressed. There may be an increased tendency to want to be identified with that. I'm not saying that they are not that. I'm simply saying that people need to be mindful of that, and also be mindful of people who want to position themselves over you. They want to tell you that they are the chosen ones and that you are not. They want to tell you that they are Judah and you are Reuben. Okay. They want to tell you that they are Judah and you are Joseph. So in their mind, they had a right to do the selling into slavery into Egypt and all of that. They sometimes want to put you in a class of people that are cursed. And so even though they are also identifying as being cursed. And so just be mindful of the identities that people try to give you while you try to figure out your own identity. And also, this is not just for individuals who might be on the receiving end of an oppressive identity, but those who are identifying themselves with these chosen identities. What exactly is that all about? You have individuals who are claiming that Abraham is their grandfather, but again, they can't tell you who the third great grandfather is. And so how they are making it all the way back to Abraham based upon a feeling and a purported curse, it's just difficult to see sometimes. And that whole dynamic of people wanting to be cursed, wanting to latch on to that identity, to explain their circumstances and what they believe their ancestors' circumstances were. It's particularly interesting because these same individuals also often identify as those who ruled Europe. And so if individuals are descended from people who were ruling Europe during the Middle Ages, ruling Europe during the Renaissance, then those individuals are not the oppressed entities. Those individuals are the ones who are responsible for the global colonization dynamic. Those individuals are connected to the ones who are responsible for the global slavery dynamic, along with their kindred over in Western Asia.